Now, the interesting thing is that von Braun was not really front and center in that ICBM development. His people were sort of on the sidelines. They were working on smaller missiles, but not very intensively at first. And von Braun had a bit of time on his hands, and he chose to use part of that time to raise the awareness of the American public about the impending reality of space travel and space exploration. Now, on the left, you see the cover of a magazine called Collier's, which was very popular in the United States in the 1940s and 50s, and reached millions of readers. And this is the cover of the first installment in a whole series of articles, different issues of Collier's over the early 1950s, dealing with these ideas of space travel. You notice the headline on the upper right that says, "Man will conquer space soon." And this was von Braun's message to the American people, that yes, this seems like science fiction right now, and in fact, Hollywood was turning out all kinds of science fiction movies like Destination Moon and others, but von Braun was treating it in a technical way and explaining to the average reader that such things were indeed possible. And the cover painting, which was done by a wonderful artist named Chesley Bonistel, who had begun working with von Braun to put his ideas on canvas, so to speak. Von Braun's design for a multi-stage manned rocket ship. You can see the big wings, which would be used for landing back on Earth. We'll find out later in this course why that design turned out not to be such a great idea, but at the moment it seemed like a good idea, and it sure made an impact on the public. Von Braun went on to team up with Walt Disney. You can see von Braun and Disney on the right. That picture shows what a kind of charismatic figure von Braun was, in his very nicely tailored suits and his Prussian good looks and demeanor. And it was von Braun and Disney collaborating on a series of television shows which were part of Walt Disney's program called Disneyland. There was a segment of these shows called Tomorrowland, and von Braun actually went on camera to tell the American public how we would eventually launch artificial satellites into space, how we might put up a manned space station, how we would send humans to the moon, and even eventually to land on Mars. Now, these programs, along with the Collier's magazines, were seen by millions of people, including many young people who went on to become scientists and engineers and even astronauts. And these people who saw von Braun's articles and TV presentations were absolutely enthralled with the vision of space exploration and space travel that he presented. And you can see here Chesley Bonistel's painting of some of the major elements of the von Braun vision. On the left, you see the uppermost stage of that three-stage piloted spaceship. In the sort of next to that, in the left of center, you see an astronomical telescope, sort of the great granddaddy of the Hubble telescope that we have today. But von Braun, of course, was presenting it as something in the future. And you see astronauts deploying the telescope. And then over on the right, notice the big white wheel-shaped space station. Now, this is truly the great iconic image of the von Braun space architecture. That is a site that still tugs at the heartstrings of many people who grew up with that vision, and even some who weren't alive then. It is really a thing of beauty. It's a concept for a space station that would hold many, many people in Earth orbit, orbiting 1,000 miles above the Earth. It would serve as an observation platform for military reconnaissance, for weather observations. You could conduct scientific experiments. You could use it as a place to live in Earth orbit and then go on to other destinations in the solar system. And the reason it was shaped like a wheel was that von Braun's concept was that it would spin around its central axis, and the resulting centrifugal force would provide a source of artificial gravity, so that if you didn't want to have to be floating around all the time and you wanted your equipment to stay down on a table and so on and so forth, well, then there you had gravity all presented for you. Of course, nowadays, we don't even think about building anything as expensive and ambitious as this. We have an International Space Station, but it does not spin, and the occupants of the space station enjoy the weightlessness that they have up there. Of course, as we'll find out, it is a medical issue that needs to be addressed for long-term missions like we want to have to go to other planets. Well, while von Braun was doing his thing on television and in the pages of Collier's, over in the Soviet Union, a man who was about 6 years older than von Braun, Sergei Korolev, was leading the Soviet effort to develop an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. Korolev had had quite a roller coaster in his own personal fortunes. He had been imprisoned in one of Stalin's labor camps during the war years and almost died. And then after the war was rehabilitated, so to speak, and put to work to create the Russian ICBM. Now, Korolev was a brilliant engineer, just as von Braun was. And he had, working with him, some of the lower-level engineers who had worked at Peenemünde. The Americans didn't get all of von Braun's team. The Soviets did get some of them. But Korolev's, under his leadership, they developed what became the first working ICBM. It was called the R7, or to the Korolev team, it was referred to as the Russian word for little seven, or Semyorka. And its first successful flight was in August of 1957. What you see on the left is a drawing of the version of the R7 that launched Sputnik. And on the right is a photograph of an R7 that is on display in Moscow. And it is the version of the R7 that launched the first Russian cosmonauts in their Vostok spacecraft, including Yuri Gagarin, beginning in 1961. But you can see the basic features of the R7 in that photo. And you notice that the rocket consists of a central tube with 4 rocket engines at its base, and strapped to that central tube are 4 additional clusters of rocket engines, for a total of how many is 5 times 4? 20 main rocket engines, which provided altogether almost 900,000 pounds of thrust. This was a tremendously powerful rocket, and it was almost 100 feet high. And indeed, it did have enough power to launch an atomic weapon or even a hydrogen bomb at the United States. It really was a functional intercontinental ballistic missile. After the first successful test in August of '57, and then a follow-up test in September, Korolev was given the go-ahead to do what he had always wanted to do with his creation, and that was to launch a satellite. And on October 4th, 1957, he and his team launched a basketball-sized sphere called Sputnik atop an R7 rocket into an orbit more than 500 miles above the Earth. And on board that satellite was a radio transmitter that would send a signal to the ground and allow radio operators on the ground to hear that signal as a series of beeps. And there were a couple of basic instruments to measure space radiation. And of course, the impact on the world was enormous. It was heralded as the opening of the space age, which of course it was. No longer was the idea of a Earth satellite science fiction. It was in fact reality.